Super Typhoon Haiyan, one of the most powerful tropical cyclones ever recorded, was a force of nature that left an indelible mark on history. Formed in the western Pacific Ocean, Haiyan began as a tropical depression on November 3, 2013. As it moved westward, it rapidly intensified, gaining strength from the warm ocean waters and low atmospheric pressure. Within just a few days, it had transformed into a super typhoon, with winds reaching an astonishing 195 miles per hour, making it one of the strongest storms to ever hit the Philippines. Haiyan's sheer power became evident as it swept across the Pacific, growing in size and intensity. By November 7, 2013, the typhoon was classified as a Category 5 storm, the highest classification for a tropical cyclone. The storm's eye was remarkably large, and the surrounding clouds and wind patterns formed a terrifying sight on satellite images. The massive storm stretched for hundreds of miles, leaving a vast swath of destruction in its path. Despite the warnings and predictions, nothing could prepare the people of the Philippines for the devastating impact that was about to unfold. Haiyan's first signs of destruction became visible as it approached the Philippines. On November 8, 2013, the typhoon made landfall on the islands of Samar and Leyte in the eastern Visayas region. As the storm hit, it brought with it extreme winds, torrential rain, and catastrophic storm surges. The coastlines were pummeled by massive waves, and the winds whipped through the trees, tearing down buildings, power lines, and anything else in their path. The typhoon was so powerful that it caused severe damage across a wide area, including well-populated cities like Tacloban. The early hours of the storm were marked by chaos and confusion. Many residents of the affected areas had been warned in advance, but the full scale of Haiyan's destruction was impossible to comprehend. In Tacloban, one of the worst-hit cities, people scrambled to find shelter as the storm's winds picked up to terrifying speeds. The city, which sits on the coast, was particularly vulnerable to the storm surges, huge walls of water that accompanied Haiyan's landfall. As the typhoon passed, the storm's powerful winds, reaching speeds of nearly 200 miles per hour, left a trail of devastation. Entire villages were leveled, roads and bridges collapsed, and power outages affected vast areas of the country. Communications were also cut off, making it nearly impossible for authorities to assess the full extent of the damage or coordinate emergency response efforts. The destruction was overwhelming, and people across the region were left in utter shock, trying to piece together what had just happened. Haiyan was not just a test of nature's strength, but also a test of humanity's resilience. The typhoon would go on to become one of the deadliest disasters in Philippine history, but it also sparked a massive international relief effort. In the face of unimaginable destruction, the world would come together to provide help, support, and aid to the communities affected by this catastrophic storm. The story of Haiyan, from its formation to its landfall, is one of nature's raw power and the courage of people determined to survive against all odds. When Super Typhoon Haiyan made landfall on November 8, 2013, it unleashed a wave of destruction unlike anything the Philippines had experienced before. The full scale of the devastation became apparent as entire communities were obliterated within hours. With winds reaching up to 195 miles per hour and massive storm surges, no part of the region was spared. The immediate impact was catastrophic, particularly in Tacloban City, which would go on to become the face of the disaster's destruction. The typhoon's storm surge, a massive wall of water generated by the strong winds, flooded coastal areas, devastating everything in its path. In Tacloban, the surge was so powerful that it swept away entire homes, cars, and buildings, leaving only piles of rubble and debris. The surge also caused widespread flooding, inundating roads, and cutting off access to essential services. Many people who lived along the coast or in low-lying areas were trapped by the rising water, with little to no warning. The destruction didn't stop at the coast. As the storm moved inland, its fury was felt across the eastern Visayas and beyond. Thousands of houses were destroyed, leaving families homeless. Infrastructure, including roads, bridges, and airports, was severely damaged or completely destroyed, making it nearly impossible for rescue teams to reach the hardest-hit areas. In some regions, communication lines were also downed, isolating entire communities from the outside world. The damage to critical infrastructure was particularly devastating. Hospitals and medical facilities were overwhelmed with the injured, but many were also damaged, rendering them unable to provide adequate care. With thousands of people in need of medical attention, the lack of resources and facilities compounded the crisis. The typhoon left hundreds of thousands of people without access to clean water, sanitation, or food. In the face of such overwhelming destruction, the need for immediate humanitarian aid was urgent. The death toll was staggering, with the Philippines government estimating that over 6,000 people lost their lives. Thousands more were injured, many severely, and the psychological trauma left behind by the typhoon was immense. Entire families were wiped out in an instant, and survivors were left with little more than the clothes on their backs. As bodies began to accumulate in the affected areas, the situation became increasingly dire, and it was clear that the devastation would take years to recover from. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of the aftermath was the sheer scale of displacement. Around 4 million people were displaced by the typhoon, forced to seek refuge in evacuation centers or with relatives. These temporary shelters, often overcrowded and lacking basic necessities, became a common sight across the affected regions. The displaced individuals faced not only physical hardships, but also emotional and mental distress as they came to terms with their losses. In the days following the disaster, the urgency for humanitarian assistance grew. The Philippines government, along with the help of international organizations and the global community, began to mobilize aid efforts. However, the scale of the disaster was so vast that it was initially difficult to coordinate the relief efforts. Thousands of relief workers from across the world were sent to help, but logistical challenges such as blocked roads and damaged airports slowed the delivery of essential supplies. In the wake of Typhoon Haiyan, the international community stepped up to provide support. Organizations like the Red Cross, UNICEF, and World Food Program, among many others, rushed to the Philippines with supplies of food, clean water, and medical equipment. However, despite their best efforts, the need for aid far outstripped the available resources, and it was clear that rebuilding would take many years. The typhoon not only brought death and destruction, but also exposed the vulnerability of the Philippines to natural disasters. The country's geographic location makes it prone to typhoons and other extreme weather events, and the impact of Haiyan underscored the need for better disaster preparedness and response systems. The lessons learned from this disaster would eventually lead to reforms and improvements in the Philippines' disaster management strategies. In the weeks following the storm, efforts to clear debris, restore power, and provide medical care were underway, but the challenge was far from over. The survivors faced an uncertain future, and it was clear that recovery would require a long-term sustained effort. The devastation left by Super Typhoon Haiyan was overwhelming, but it also brought out the strength and resilience of the Filipino people, who began the difficult process of rebuilding their lives from the rubble. As the full extent of the devastation from Super Typhoon Haiyan began to unfold, it became evident that the scale of the disaster was so immense that no single country or organization could handle the response on its own. The Philippine government was stretched thin, trying to coordinate relief efforts amidst widespread damage and communication breakdowns. Local authorities, many of whom had lost their own homes and loved ones, were unable to immediately respond on the ground. It was then that the international community rose to the occasion, sending help from all corners of the globe. The initial days after the typhoon struck were chaotic, as rescue teams scrambled to locate survivors, distribute aid, and provide medical assistance. It was a race against time. Roads were blocked, airports were damaged, and many communities were completely cut off from the outside world. Despite these challenges, local first responders, firefighters, police, and ordinary citizens risked their lives to help those in need. They carried survivors to safety, dug through rubble in search of the missing, and provided whatever resources they could muster. The response from international organizations was swift and extensive. The United Nations, along with non-governmental organizations, NGOs, including the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, sent thousands of experts, volunteers, and humanitarian workers to assist with the crisis. Among the first to arrive were medical teams, who set up field hospitals to treat the wounded. Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, one of the most prominent medical aid groups in the world, arrived in the hardest hit areas, offering vital treatment and care to the injured. This swift medical response undoubtedly saved countless lives in the aftermath. One of the most significant challenges in the aftermath of Typhoon Haiyan was ensuring that survivors received enough food and clean water. The typhoon destroyed agricultural crops and devastated fishing communities, leaving families without access to the resources they had once relied on. International relief teams worked tirelessly to airlift food and water supplies to the most vulnerable regions. The World Food Program, WFP, led the charge, distributing tons of rice, canned goods, and water to the displaced population. Emergency food distributions were coordinated in evacuation centers, providing temporary relief to those who had lost everything. But it wasn't just about food and water. The psychological toll of the disaster was overwhelming. Survivors, many of whom had lost loved ones, their homes, and their livelihoods, faced a future filled with uncertainty and trauma. Mental health support was just as important as physical aid. Psychologists and counselors were deployed to help people cope with the overwhelming grief, fear, and stress that followed the disaster. The emotional scars from the tragedy would last long after the physical rebuilding was complete. Meanwhile, nations around the world pledged millions of dollars in aid to assist the Philippines' recovery. Countries like the United States, Australia, Japan, and the United Kingdom sent financial contributions, supplies, and technical expertise. The U.S. military played a critical role in the immediate aftermath, providing search and rescue teams, helicopters for aerial assessments, and even airlifting supplies to isolated areas. The American Red Cross also mobilized large-scale disaster relief efforts, coordinating with local chapters to ensure supplies reach those in need. In addition to the large-scale international aid, smaller grassroots organizations played a vital role in the relief process. Local churches, community groups, and volunteers came together to provide food, clothing, and shelter to those who had lost everything. Some Filipino citizens whose own homes were intact opened their doors to their fellow countrymen, offering refuge in the face of unimaginable devastation. This spirit of solidarity became one of the defining characteristics of the recovery efforts. Despite the overwhelming destruction, the resilience of the Filipino people was undeniable. Even in the face of tragedy, survivors began to rebuild their communities, often with the assistance of local and international volunteers. In Tacloban, one of the hardest hit cities, people started to return to their homes as soon as it was safe to do so. Many families sought to salvage what they could from the rubble, making do with what little they had left. The Philippines government, alongside international partners, began to formulate a plan for long-term recovery, focusing on rebuilding infrastructure, restoring vital services, and improving disaster preparedness for the future. Throughout the recovery process, a critical lesson became clear: the importance of international cooperation. The Typhoon Haiyan response demonstrated how countries could work together in the face of a crisis to provide critical support to those who needed it the most. While the immediate devastation from the typhoon was devastating, the global effort to help the Philippines showed the world the power of unity and the strength that can be found in the aftermath of tragedy. As weeks turned into months, the tireless work of humanitarian organizations and local responders helped the Philippines recover in many ways. The emotional scars of the typhoon were deep, but the resilience and courage of the Filipino people, supported by the generosity of the global community, ensured that life would begin again in the wake of this unparalleled disaster. The heroism displayed by first responders, volunteers, and survivors proved that even in the darkest moments, hope and humanity can shine through. As the dust settled in the wake of Super Typhoon Haiyan, the task of rebuilding the devastated communities was only beginning. While immediate aid was essential in providing life-saving assistance, the true challenge lay in the long-term recovery efforts. Rebuilding homes, restoring infrastructure, and revitalizing the economy were monumental undertakings, but it was also an opportunity to address the vulnerabilities that had made the Philippines so susceptible to such a catastrophic disaster in the first place. The lessons learned from Haiyan would shape the country's future disaster preparedness and response strategies for years to come. One of the first lessons that emerged was the need for stronger, more resilient infrastructure. Many buildings, roads, and bridges were simply not equipped to withstand the intense winds and flooding brought on by the typhoon. In the years following the disaster, the Philippine government, in collaboration with international partners, worked to improve the resilience of critical infrastructure. New construction projects focused on using more durable materials and designs that could withstand future storms. The aim was to create a more disaster-resilient environment, especially in areas known to be at high risk for typhoons and other extreme weather events. Another significant lesson came from the sheer scale of the storm surge, which devastated coastal communities. Haiyan demonstrated just how vulnerable these areas were to storm surges and flooding, which often had the most destructive impact. In response, new policies were enacted to relocate people from high-risk areas. Many coastal communities were given assistance to moved to safer locations further inland, where the threat of storm surges would be minimized. This strategy became part of the Philippines' broader disaster risk reduction and management program. In the aftermath of the typhoon, the Philippines also took steps to strengthen its early warning systems. While the country had some disaster preparedness systems in place, Typhoon Haiyan's rapid intensification and the speed with which it made landfall revealed gaps in the country's ability to forecast and respond to such extreme events. By improving meteorological tools and enhancing communication systems, the government aimed to give citizens more time to prepare for future storms. The installation of more sophisticated early warning systems, including mobile alerts and local evacuation procedures, would ensure that people in high-risk areas had the necessary information to act quickly when the next disaster struck. Moreover, the tragedy highlighted the importance of disaster preparedness education at the local level. Communities that had been trained in disaster response were often more resilient in the face of calamity. Schools, local governments, and community centers began to host regular drills and educational programs to teach people how to respond in case of a natural disaster. The typhoon served as a wake-up call, leading to widespread efforts to ensure that every citizen understood the risks they faced and knew what steps to take to protect themselves and their families. The economic impact of Typhoon Haiyan was profound. Thousands of people lost their livelihoods, especially in sectors like agriculture and fishing, which are critical to the Philippine economy. The destruction of crops, the sinking of fishing boats, and the collapse of businesses left many communities struggling to get back on their feet. Rebuilding the economy became a key priority, with efforts focused on restoring agricultural production, providing microloans to small businesses, and offering employment opportunities to those who had lost their jobs. International donors also stepped in to support these economic recovery efforts, providing funding for job creation and economic rebuilding projects. On a global scale, Super Typhoon Haiyan helped to reignite discussions about the impacts of climate change and the vulnerability of many developing countries to extreme weather events. Haiyan's intensity and destruction were a stark reminder of the dangers posed by a warming planet. In the years following the typhoon, the Philippines became a vocal advocate for global action on climate change, calling for stronger international agreements to mitigate the effects of rising global temperatures. The country's experience with Haiyan became a powerful example for other nations to take climate action seriously and prioritize disaster risk reduction in the face of an uncertain future. As time passed, the physical scars of Typhoon Haiyan began to fade. Many communities were rebuilt, and infrastructure was restored. However, the emotional and psychological scars left by the storm remained. Families that had lost loved ones, communities that had been uprooted, and survivors who had witnessed unimaginable destruction carried the weight of this trauma for years. Mental health support continued to be a critical component of the recovery process, and local organizations continued to offer counseling and support to those struggling with the aftermath. Super Typhoon Haiyan had undoubtedly left a lasting mark on the Philippines, but it also demonstrated the resilience of the Filipino people. The courage, determination, and solidarity shown in the face of disaster were nothing short of inspiring. While the storm itself was a tragedy, the recovery efforts that followed highlighted the power of global cooperation, the strength of the human spirit, and the importance of preparedness in the face of the unknown. In conclusion, the lessons learned from Typhoon Haiyan have had a profound impact on disaster management practices in the Philippines and around the world. The typhoon underscored the need for stronger, more resilient communities and infrastructure, the importance of early warning systems, and the critical role of international cooperation. As the country continues to rebuild and prepare for future storms, the spirit of unity and resilience remains a powerful reminder of what can be achieved even in the darkest of times. Though the memory of Typhoon Haiyan will never fade, the efforts to protect lives and livelihoods in the future will ensure that its legacy lives on in the form of a more prepared, resilient world.